The detention block of the Korthak Imperial Command ship hummed with the low vibration of engines that could shatter planets. General Vex-Tar stood before the energy barrier containing his latest prize, his 4 arms crossed behind his back in a display of military precision. The creature inside looked pathetically small against the reinforced walls of the cell. She appeared to be no more than a young female of her species, barely reaching his shoulder height even if he weren't standing at his full 8-foot frame. Her skin was pale, almost translucent under the harsh detention lighting, and her frame seemed delicate enough to snap with minimal pressure. The intelligence reports had been laughably wrong, he thought. This was what the humans called their secret weapon. Dr. Elena Vasquez sat quietly on the metal bench, her hands folded in her lap, watching the alien general with calm brown eyes. She had been captured during the failed defense of Europa Station 3 cycles ago. And since then, the Korthak Empire had been trying to extract information about human military capabilities. They had chosen the wrong person to underestimate. General Vex-Tar's mandibles clicked in what his species considered amusement. The Korthak had conquered 17 different civilizations across the galaxy. Each had fallen within solar rotations of first contact. The pattern was always the same. Initial resistance, desperate last stands, then inevitable surrender when faced with the Empire's overwhelming technological superiority. Humans were proving to be no different, despite their reputation for unpredictability. Subject designation: human female, scientific classification. He spoke into his recording device, his translator converting his chittering language into something the human could understand. Physical assessment confirms species weakness. Bone density appears insufficient for combat effectiveness. Muscle mass negligible. No visible defensive adaptations. Elena said nothing, continuing to observe him with those unsettling eyes. There was something in her gaze that made Vex-Tar's exoskeleton itch, though he attributed it to the inferior environmental controls in the detention section. The general had earned his rank through 3 decades of successful campaigns. He had personally overseen the subjugation of the crystal-based Zephyrians, whose bodies could deflect energy weapons. He had broken the will of the Thornback Collective, creatures that could regenerate from nearly any injury. Humans, by comparison, seemed almost insultingly fragile. Your species surrendered Europa Station after minimal resistance, he continued, circling the containment field slowly. 17 of your kind died in the first engagement. The remainder fled or surrendered within moments. Yet our intelligence suggests you were involved in developing countermeasures against our forces. Elena finally spoke, her voice soft but clear. Intelligence can be misleading, General. The way she said his rank made his secondary arms twitch involuntarily. There was no fear in her tone, no desperation that he had come to expect from captured enemies. If anything, she sounded almost patient. Indeed, Vex-Tar agreed. Which is why you will provide us with accurate information about human military capabilities, defensive positions, and technological developments. The sooner you comply, the sooner your suffering ends. I'm not suffering, General. This gave him pause. He studied her more carefully, noting the steady rise and fall of her chest, the relaxed posture, the absence of stress indicators his briefings had told him to watch for in human subjects. According to his data, humans should be exhibiting signs of panic when separated from their social groups and placed in threatening situations. Perhaps you do not understand your situation, he said, activating a control panel. The containment field shimmered as the atmospheric pressure inside increased by 30%. Most species would experience immediate discomfort at minimum. You are a prisoner of the Korthak Empire. Your home system is under siege. Your military forces are scattered and demoralized. Cooperation is your only path to survival. Elena didn't even blink as the pressure change hit her. If anything, she looked slightly more comfortable, as if the new atmosphere agreed with her better than the previous settings. I understand the situation perfectly, General, she replied. The question is whether you do. Vex-Tar's irritation was growing. He had broken hardened warriors with less provocation than this. The female should be begging for mercy, offering information, or at least showing some sign that his presence commanded respect. Instead, She sat there like she was waiting for something. "Computer, display human female's biological readings," he commanded. A holographic display materialized beside the containment field, showing Elena's vital signs in real time. Heart rate, steady and normal. Stress hormones, within baseline parameters. Neural activity, calm and focused. Either the human was exhibiting some unknown form of psychological conditioning, or she genuinely felt no fear. The second possibility was more disturbing than the first. "Your readings suggest you are not experiencing appropriate levels of distress for your situation," Vextar observed. "Are you perhaps suffering from a neurological condition that prevents proper threat assessment?" Elena smiled for the first time since her capture. It wasn't a pleasant expression, despite the way it transformed her features. "My threat assessment is working perfectly, General. That's actually the problem." "Explain." She stood up slowly, her movements flowing and controlled despite the increased atmospheric pressure that should have made coordination difficult. "You've studied human military engagements, obviously, but you've only seen us fighting defensively, protecting civilian populations and infrastructure we couldn't afford to lose." Vextar's primary arms moved instinctively toward his weapon harness, though he couldn't identify any specific threat. The human remained on the other side of an energy barrier that could contain a plasma detonation. She posed no immediate danger. "You've never seen us when we have nothing left to lose," Elena continued, walking slowly toward the barrier. "You've never seen what we're actually capable of when someone makes the mistake of threatening everything we care about. Threats are irrelevant from your position," Vextar stated, though he found himself taking a step backward. "You are contained and helpless. General, do you know what I did before the war started?" The question seemed to come from nowhere. Vextar consulted his datapad quickly, scanning through the intelligence report on his prisoner. "You were a research scientist. Biological systems analysis, xenobiology, specifically. I spent 15 years studying alien life forms, trying to understand how different species adapted to various environments and threats." Elena placed her hand against the energy barrier, and Vextar was disturbed to notice that the field didn't even flicker. Most organic matter created some kind of feedback when it contacted the containment system. "Your expertise is irrelevant to your current situation." "Is it?" Elena asked. "Because I've spent the last 3 cycles studying you, General, studying your species, learning everything I could about Korthak biology, psychology, and social structures." Vextar felt his confidence wavering for the first time in decades. There was something in the human's voice that suggested she wasn't simply trying to intimidate him. She sounded like she was stating facts. "Human intelligence-gathering capabilities are limited," he said, more to reassure himself than to convince her. "Your technology cannot match our security protocols." Elena laughed, and the sound made his exoskeleton contract involuntarily. "Technology? General, I haven't needed technology for this analysis. You've been providing me with all the data I need just by standing there." "Impossible." Your breathing pattern shifted when I mentioned xenobiology. Your secondary arms moved toward your weapons when I stood up. Despite the fact that I'm contained and unarmed, your posture changed when I smiled. Elena's voice took on the clinical tone of a scientist presenting research findings. "Your species evolved as pursuit predators, didn't you? High stress responses to unexpected behavior from prey species. Aggressive territorial displays when challenged. Pack hunting instincts that make you uncomfortable when facing threats alone." Vextar realized he was breathing faster than normal. The human's casual analysis of his species' behavioral patterns was unnerving, but more concerning was the accuracy of her observations. The Korthak military kept their evolutionary history classified for exactly these reasons. "These observations mean nothing," he insisted. "Don't they?" Elena moved closer to the barrier, and Vextar found himself taking another step back before he could stop himself. "Your species conquered 17 civilizations using the same basic approach every time. Overwhelming initial assault to trigger fear responses, followed by systematic psychological pressure until resistance collapses. It works beautifully against species that evolved as prey animals or herd creatures." She paused, studying his face with those unsettling brown eyes. "But humans didn't evolve as prey, General. We evolved as persistence hunters. We're the species that ran mammoth to death across frozen plains. We're the creatures that learned to track wounded predators for days through hostile territory. We're the ones who developed the patience to wait in ambush for weeks at a time. Vextar's hand had moved to his sidearm without conscious decision. The motion was purely instinctive, driven by threat assessment systems that had kept his ancestors alive for millions of years. The fact that the human had provoked this response while confined behind an energy barrier should have been impossible. "You are attempting psychological manipulation," he stated, trying to regain control of the situation. "Your position remains hopeless regardless of your words." Elena shook her head slowly. "I'm not trying to manipulate you, General. I'm trying to educate you, because in about 6 minutes, you're going to need to make some very important decisions, and I want you to understand exactly what you're dealing with." 6 minutes until what? The human checked something on her wrist, though Vextar could see no chronometer or communication device. 6 minutes until the Korthak command staff realizes that their prize prisoner isn't actually helpless. Vextar activated his communication implant immediately. "Security. Report status of detention block 7. Static answered him. "Computer. Display current location of detention security personnel." The holographic display flickered and showed an error message. Communications throughout the ship section appeared to be experiencing interference. Elena watched his growing alarm with clinical interest. "You should probably try to contact your engineering section next. I'm curious to see how long it takes them to realize what's happening to their environmental systems." The general's training took over. He drew his plasma weapon and aimed it at the containment field controls. If the prisoner had somehow compromised ship security, the safest option was immediate termination. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Elena said calmly. "That containment field isn't just keeping me in, General. Right now, it's keeping something else out." Vextar hesitated, his weapon trained on the control panel. "What are you talking about?" "Tell me, when your intelligence teams analyzed human biological samples, did they focus on our obvious weaknesses, our fragile bone structure, our limited muscle mass, our apparent vulnerability to environmental hazards?" "Obviously," Elena nodded approvingly. "Good scientific methodology. Very thorough. I'm sure they cataloged everything that could kill us easily. But did they happen to notice what we carry with us everywhere we go?" Vextar's confusion must have shown on his face, because Elena continued without waiting for an answer. "Bacteria, General. Trillions of them. Living inside us, on us, throughout our entire digestive and respiratory systems. Most of them perfectly harmless to humans because we evolved together over millions of years. But to species that developed on different worlds, with different biochemistries, the implications hit Vextar like a plasma blast to the chest. He activated his emergency medical scanner and aimed it at the human. The readings that came back made his exoskeleton feel suddenly cold. Elena was carrying hundreds of different microorganisms, just as she had said. Most registered as unknown to Korthak medical databases, but the scanner was already identifying several that showed aggressive reproductive potential in Korthak tissue samples. "You're contaminated," he whispered. "No, General. I'm a weapon." The realization struck General Vextar with the force of a collapsing star. His weapon trembled in his primary hands as the full scope of his mistake became clear. The atmospheric recycling systems had been processing the human's exhalations for 3 cycles. Every breath she took, every skin cell she shed, every microscopic particle that sloughed off her seemingly fragile form had been distributed throughout his ship. "Impossible," he breathed, though his medical scanner continued to display readings that contradicted his denial. "Our decontamination protocols are absolute. Nothing survives our sterilization procedures." Elena regarded him with something that might have been pity. "Your protocols are designed to eliminate known threats, General. But you can't sterilize against something you've never encountered before. And some of the organisms humans carry aren't just unknown to your systems. They're specifically adapted to exploit the biochemical pathways your species uses to process oxygen." Vextar's secondary hands moved to his communication array, desperately trying to raise his medical officer. The static that answered was more pronounced now. filled with what sounded like distant alarms. His breathing became more labored as stress hormones flooded his system. "You're lying," he said. But even as the words left his mandibles, he could feel a strange burning sensation beginning in his respiratory chambers. This is psychological warfare. Humans lack the biological sophistication for such weapons. Do we? Elena asked softly. "General, your intelligence files probably contain detailed analysis of human military technology, population centers, industrial capacity. But did anyone think to study our medical history? Did they analyze our relationship with disease and biological threats?" She began pacing slowly within her containment field, her movements fluid and controlled. To Vextar's increasingly paranoid perception, she looked less like a prisoner and more like a predator circling wounded prey. "Humans have been fighting biological warfare for our entire evolutionary history," she continued. "Plagues that wiped out continents. Diseases that jumped from other species into our population. Viruses that evolved specifically to exploit our biological systems. We didn't just survive these encounters, General. We adapted. We became living laboratories for biological resistance." Vextar tried to focus on his tactical training, but the burning in his respiratory system was getting worse. His scanner showed elevated bacterial levels throughout the detention section, and the readings were climbing exponentially. Whatever the human carried was reproducing at an alarming rate in the ship's atmosphere. "Even if your claims have merit," he managed, "you are still contained. You will die with the rest of us if your biological agents prove lethal." Elena stopped pacing and turned to face him directly. "Will I, General?" The question hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. Vextar realized that despite 3 cycles of imprisonment, the human showed no signs of illness or deterioration. If anything, she appeared healthier than when she had first been brought aboard. Her skin had more color, her movements were more energetic, and her mental acuity seemed sharper than ever. "The organisms I carry aren't just weapons, General. They're symbiotic partners. They've been protecting humans from hostile environments for thousands of years." Elena placed both hands against the containment barrier. And for the first time, Vextar noticed that her skin temperature was registering several degrees higher than baseline human norms. "What's toxic to your species is beneficial to mine." The General's communication implant finally crackled to life, filled with panicked voices speaking in rapid Korthak. "Medical emergency and engineering. Atmospheric contamination detected in crew quarters. 17 personnel reporting respiratory distress." The reports kept coming, each one confirming Elena's impossible claims. "Stop this," Vextar demanded, raising his weapon toward the containment field. "Reverse whatever process you have initiated, or I will execute you immediately." Elena didn't even glance at the plasma rifle aimed in her direction. "Execute me with what, General?" Vextar looked down at his weapon in confusion. The power indicator was flashing red, showing insufficient charge for weapon discharge. He had recharged it that morning. Following standard protocol, the power cell should have been good for dozens of shots. "Electromagnetic interference," Elena explained helpfully. "Another side effect of the biological process, currently spreading through your ship. The organisms I carry produce trace amounts of metallic compounds as waste products. In sufficient concentrations, those compounds create electromagnetic fields that interfere with your technology." The implications cascaded through Vextar's tactical awareness like falling dominoes. Communications failing. Weapons malfunctioning. Life support systems potentially compromised. His entire ship was being systematically disabled by microscopic organisms that his sensors couldn't even detect until they had already established overwhelming population density. "This is biological terrorism," he accused, though his voice lacked conviction. His own words sounded hollow even to him. "No, General, this is evolution." Elena's calm certainty was more terrifying than any threat she could have made. She spoke like a scientist presenting peer-reviewed research, stating facts rather than making claims. The clinical detachment in her voice suggested that she viewed the current situation not as a desperate gambit, but as an inevitable outcome. "Your species has spent generations perfecting the art of conquest through superior technology and psychological manipulation," she continued. "You developed energy weapons, force fields, atmospheric processors, faster than light travel. You built an empire on the assumption that technological superiority would always triumph over biological limitations. Vextar felt his knees growing weak. The burning in his respiratory system had spread to his digestive chambers, and his exoskeleton was beginning to feel uncomfortably warm. Around him, the detention section's environmental controls were making increasingly distressed sounds as they struggled to maintain atmospheric balance. But technology has a weakness, General. It's designed by intelligent minds to solve known problems. When you encounter something outside your design parameters, your systems fail. Elena gestured around the detention section, where status lights were beginning to flicker ominously. Biological systems, on the other hand, don't solve problems. They evolve around them. The general tried to activate his emergency beacon, hoping to signal other ships in the fleet. The device remained silent, its circuits compromised by the same electromagnetic interference that had disabled his weapon. For the first time in his military career, Vextar felt completely cut off from support. "What do you want?" he asked, hating the desperation he could hear creeping into his own voice. Elena tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question. "That's an interesting way to phrase it, General. What I want isn't really relevant to this situation." "Then what is relevant? What humanity needs?" Her voice hardened almost imperceptibly. "We need your species to understand that we are not prey animals to be hunted and captured at will. We need the Korthak Empire to recognize that attacking human colonies has consequences that extend far beyond your immediate tactical objectives." Vextar's communication implant burst to life with a transmission from his ship's medical bay. The voice of his chief medical officer was thick with panic and barely controlled terror. "General, we have a situation. The biological contamination has spread to all sections of the ship. Personnel are experiencing respiratory failure, digestive system breakdown, and neurological symptoms. Our medical protocols are ineffective against unknown pathogens. We need immediate evacuation to sterile facilities." Elena had heard the transmission clearly through the failing containment field. Her expression showed no satisfaction at the report, only the same clinical interest she had displayed throughout their conversation. "Evacuation won't help," she said matter-of-factly. "The organisms are already established in your crew's biological systems. Moving to a different environment will only delay the inevitable." Vextar's hands shook as he tried to process tactical options. His training had prepared him for conventional warfare, boarding actions, siege tactics, even nuclear engagement scenarios. Nothing in his military education had covered biological warfare conducted by prisoners who appeared to be voluntary carriers of weaponized diseases. "There must be countermeasures," he insisted. "Medical treatments, sterilization procedures, something." "There are," Elena agreed, "but you don't have access to them." The general's hope flared briefly before being crushed by her next words. The treatments required detailed knowledge of human biochemistry, specifically the symbiotic relationships between humans and their carried microorganisms. That information exists, but it's classified at levels your intelligence services have never penetrated. Vextar realized he was looking at a tactical situation unlike any he had encountered in 3 decades of military service. The enemy had infiltrated his position not through superior firepower or advanced technology, but through biological systems so fundamental that he had never considered them weapons at all. "You planned this," he accused. "Your capture was intentional." Elena finally smiled again. And this time, there was something genuinely warm in the expression. "Planning suggests we knew exactly how things would unfold." "That's not quite accurate." She walked closer to the containment barrier, and Vextar found himself backing away despite his military training. The human no longer looked fragile or helpless. She looked like exactly what she claimed to be. A weapon that had been brought into the heart of his ship and allowed to deploy without opposition. "We knew that capturing humans would expose your species to biological agents you had never encountered. We knew that your medical systems would be unprepared for the complexity of human symbiotic relationships, but we didn't know exactly how those factors would interact with Korthak physiology." Vextar felt cold understanding wash over him. "You used your own people as test subjects." "We used volunteers, General. scientists who understood the risks and chose to accept them in order to gather critical intelligence about enemy capabilities. Elena's voice carried no apology or regret. Just like you used captured humans to test the effectiveness of your psychological interrogation techniques, the comparison stung because it was accurate. Vextar had authorized numerous experimental procedures on human prisoners, justifying them as necessary intelligence gathering. The idea that humans might employ similar tactics had never occurred to him. His medical scanner showed that bacterial concentrations throughout the detention section had reached critical levels. Whatever Elena carried was now reproducing exponentially in the ship's atmosphere. Overwhelming environmental controls, and spreading through ventilation systems at an alarming rate. "How long do we have?" he asked quietly. Elena consulted her wrist again, though Vextar still couldn't see any visible timepiece. "For your crew? Perhaps 6 hours before respiratory failure becomes irreversible. For your ship's systems? The electromagnetic interference will reach critical levels within the next hour. And for you? I'll be fine, General. This is what humans look like when we're in our natural environment." The statement hit Vextar like a physical blow. The detention section's recycled atmosphere, toxic to his species and deadly to his crew, was natural to the human. She wasn't surviving the contamination, she was thriving in it. Around them, the lights flickered and dimmed as ship systems began failing in cascade. In the distance, Vextar could hear the sounds of his crew struggling with equipment that no longer responded to commands. His empire's technological superiority was crumbling under assault from organisms too small to see and too primitive to understand. "What are your terms?" he asked, the words bitter as poison in his mouth. Elena stepped back from the containment barrier and sat down on her bench again, returning to the same calm posture she had maintained throughout her imprisonment. "That, General, is not my decision to make." General Vextar collapsed into a chair that had materialized from the ship's emergency medical systems, his exoskeleton gleaming with perspiration that his species rarely produced except under extreme duress. The burning in his respiratory chambers had evolved into sharp, stabbing pains that made each breath a conscious effort. Around him, the once proud command vessel of the Korthak Empire groaned with the sounds of failing systems and dying crew members. "Not your decision?" he gasped, looking at Elena through vision that was beginning to blur around the edges. "Then whose?" Elena remained seated calmly on her bench, apparently unaffected by the atmospheric chaos that was systematically killing everyone else aboard the ship. "The decision belongs to Admiral Chen, commander of the Human Defense Fleet. She's currently in negotiations with your high command." Vextar tried to access his ship's communication array to verify this claim, but the interference patterns had rendered all long-range systems inoperable. He was cut off from fleet command, trapped in a dying ship with a human who seemed increasingly less like a prisoner and more like an executioner. "Impossible," he wheezed. "The human fleet was scattered. Your forces lack the capability for coordinated operations on this scale." "Do they?" Elena asked with that same clinical curiosity that had characterized her entire conversation. "General, how many human prisoners has your empire taken over the past year?" Vextar accessed his tactical database through sheer force of will, though the process required several attempts as his cognitive functions began to deteriorate. Approximately 43 individuals across 7 different engagement zones. And where are those prisoners being held? The implications hit him like a plasma torpedo to the bridge. Fleet command vessels. Research stations. Intelligence facilities. Elena nodded approvingly. 43 volunteers, General. 43 scientists who understood exactly what they were carrying and where they were going. 43 biological weapons delivered directly into the heart of your military infrastructure. Vextar's secondary hands clutched at his chest as respiratory distress made speech difficult. The strategic picture that Elena was describing represented a level of coordination and tactical thinking that challenged everything he knew about human capabilities. His species had assumed they were fighting a desperate, disorganized resistance. Instead, they had been systematically infiltrated by an enemy that fought wars on biological timescales. "The negotiations," he managed. "What are the terms?" "Complete withdrawal of Korthak forces from all human territories. reparations for destroyed colonies, formal recognition of human sovereignty. Elena's voice carried the same matter-of-fact tone she had used throughout their conversation. And unrestricted access to medical treatment for your infected personnel. The final condition made Vextar's mandibles click involuntarily. Even in his deteriorating state, he recognized the tactical brilliance of the human position. They weren't just offering survival, they were demonstrating absolute control over life and death for his entire species. "You're Admiral Chen," he said with growing difficulty. "She will have authorization to negotiate these terms?" "Admiral Chen has full authority from the Human Unified Government," Elena confirmed. "But the negotiations aren't really about authorization, General. They're about timing." Vextar's confusion must have shown despite his species' typically expressionless features, because Elena continued without prompting. "Every hour your high command delays acceptance increases the contamination levels throughout your fleet. Every day they spend in discussions reduces the effectiveness of potential medical countermeasures. The biological agents I and the other volunteers carry aren't just weapons, they're evolutionary accelerators." She stood and walked to the containment barrier, which was now flickering intermittently as power fluctuations cascaded through the ship's failing electrical grid. "The organisms adapt to their environment, General. The longer they remain in Korthak biological systems, the more effective they become at exploiting your species' biochemical weaknesses." Vextar tried to stand but found his legs no longer capable of supporting his weight. The chair's medical systems activated automatically, providing supplemental oxygen and monitoring his vital signs. But the readings displayed were uniformly alarming. His body was shutting down, system by system, as unknown pathogens overwhelmed every defensive mechanism his immune system possessed. "How long?" he asked, though he wasn't certain if he was asking about his own survival or his empire's capitulation. "For you personally?" "Without medical intervention, perhaps 2 more hours." Elena's clinical assessment held no malice, only scientific accuracy. "For your fleet, our projections suggest complete tactical incapacitation within 72 hours. The General's communication implant crackled with increasingly desperate reports from throughout the ship. Engineering had lost main power. Life support was operating on emergency backup systems. The medical bay was overwhelmed with casualties exhibiting symptoms that matched no known pathology in Korthak databases. "This is genocide," Vextar accused, though his voice lacked the strength for proper indignation. Elena's expression hardened slightly. "No, General. This is proportional response." She activated something on her wrist, and for the first time, Vextar could see that she wore a small device that had been invisible to his earlier scans. A holographic display materialized between them, showing star charts and casualty reports. "Europa Station, 43,000 civilian casualties. New Geneva Colony, 17,000 dead, including 8,000 children. Armstrong Research Facility, complete destruction of irreplaceable scientific archives dating back 4 centuries. Elena's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath the clinical tone. "Your empire has been conducting genocide against human populations for the past 18 months. We are simply ensuring that you understand the consequences of that policy." Vextar studied the holographic data through vision that was becoming increasingly unreliable. The human casualties were staggering, representing not just military losses but the systematic destruction of civilian populations. His tactical training had classified these as acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of strategic objectives. From Elena's perspective, they were war crimes that demanded response. "The contamination," he said weakly. "Can it be contained?" "Not contained," Elena replied. "But it can be treated. Human medical science has developed countermeasures for the biological agents we carry. Those treatments can be synthesized and distributed to Korthak personnel." She paused, letting the implications settle in Vextar's deteriorating consciousness. "But synthesis requires detailed knowledge of both human and Korthak biochemistry. It requires cooperation between our medical teams and your personnel. It requires trust." Vextar understood the strategic position perfectly, despite his failing cognitive functions. The humans had not only infiltrated his empire's military infrastructure with biological weapons, They had positioned themselves as the sole source of treatment for the resulting contamination. Surrender was no longer just militarily advisable. It was the only path to species survival. "Your people," he gasped. "The volunteers. They knew they might not survive this operation." "They knew," Elena confirmed. Dr. Martinez was a xenobiologist with 3 children. Professor Kim had been working on interspecies disease vectors for 20 years. Lieutenant Morrison volunteered because her brother died defending New Geneva. Each name hit Vex-Tar like a separate weapon. These weren't desperate civilians conscripted into suicide missions. They were professionals who had made calculated decisions to sacrifice themselves in order to protect their species. The level of commitment and tactical thinking required for such operations suggested that humans possessed strategic capabilities his empire had never recognized. "What happens now?" he asked. Elena checked her device again. "Now we wait. Admiral Chen's negotiation team is in contact with your high command. Medical teams are standing by to provide treatment protocols as soon as acceptable terms are reached. Emergency support vessels are already en route to assist with evacuation and decontamination procedures." Vex-Tar's scanner showed that contamination levels throughout the ship had reached critical thresholds. His crew was dying, his vessel was crippled, and his empire faced potential extinction unless they accepted human terms. Yet the humans had already prepared medical assistance and evacuation support. They had planned not just for victory, but for the survival of their enemies. "You could have simply exterminated us," he realized. "Yes," Elena agreed. "The biological agents we carry could be modified for 100% lethality with minimal effort. But extermination wasn't our objective." "Then what was?" Elena sat back down on her bench, returning to the calm posture she had maintained throughout their conversation. Despite the chaos surrounding them, despite the systematic failure of Korthak technology and the dying of his crew, she remained completely composed. "Education, General. We needed to teach your empire that humans are not prey animals to be hunted and captured. We needed to demonstrate that attacking our species carries consequences that extend far beyond conventional military retaliation." Vex-Tar's communication implant activated one final time, carrying a transmission from the Korthak High Command. The voice of Supreme Commander Thexval was barely recognizable through the static and interference, but his message was clear enough. "All fleet commanders, implement immediate ceasefire protocols. Accept human terms for medical assistance. Begin evacuation procedures for contaminated vessels. Negotiations are proceeding under emergency authority." Elena heard the transmission and nodded approvingly. "Excellent timing. Medical teams should arrive within 6 hours. You planned for this exact scenario," Vex-Tar said. "It wasn't a question. We planned for multiple scenarios," Elena corrected. "But yes, this was considered one of the more likely outcomes. Your species responds predictably to existential threats." Through the failing containment barrier, Vex-Tar could see Elena's breathing change subtly. The calm, steady rhythm she had maintained throughout their conversation was shifting to something deeper and more regular. Her skin temperature was increasing, and her metabolic readings showed acceleration that would be dangerous for most species. "What's happening to you?" he asked. Elena smiled one more time, and this expression carried genuine warmth mixed with something that might have been sympathy. "The final phase, General. The organisms I carry aren't just weapons, they're also medical tools. Now that the tactical objective has been achieved, they're beginning to synthesize the compounds your species needs for treatment." Vex-Tar stared at her in disbelief. "You're producing the cure?" "I'm becoming the cure," Elena corrected. "By the time the medical teams arrive, my biochemistry will have adapted to produce therapeutic agents specifically tailored to Korthak physiology. The other volunteers throughout your fleet are undergoing the same process." The strategic implications were staggering. The humans hadn't just infiltrated his empire with biological weapons, they had deployed living pharmaceutical laboratories that could adapt in real time to provide species-specific medical treatment. The same individuals who had brought his fleet to its knees were now preparing to save the lives of his crew. "Why?" Vex-Tar whispered. "Why preserve us after what we've done?" "Why?" Elena considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Because extinction is permanent, General. Mistakes can be corrected, but death cannot be undone. Your empire made the mistake of assuming humans were weak because we appeared fragile. We're correcting that misunderstanding. As if summoned by her words, new readings began appearing on Vex's Tar's medical scanner. The bacterial concentrations that had been overwhelming his ship's atmosphere were shifting, producing chemical compounds that his failing immune system recognized as beneficial rather than toxic. The burning in his respiratory chambers began to subside, replaced by a cooling sensation that felt like the first breath of fresh air after emerging from underwater. "The treatment has begun," Elena observed. "Your symptoms should start improving within the next hour." Vex-Tar felt strength returning to his limbs as his body's defensive systems stood down from their futile battle against the human-carried organisms. Around him, the ship's environmental controls were stabilizing as electromagnetic interference patterns shifted to more benign frequencies. "When this is over," he said slowly, "when your medical teams have treated my crew, and we have withdrawn from human territories, what then?" Elena leaned back against the wall of her containment cell, finally looking like the tired human she actually was, rather than the inexorable force of nature she had appeared to be throughout their conversation. "Then we hope your species learns from this experience," she said simply. "We hope you understand that humans are not victims to be preyed upon, but partners who can offer both terrible consequences and remarkable benefits depending on how we're approached." Vex-Tar managed to stand for the first time in hours, his exoskeleton no longer feeling like it was burning from the inside. Through the ship's communication systems, he could hear his crew beginning to report improvements in their conditions. The sounds of dying machinery were being replaced by the steady hum of restored life support systems. "And if we don't learn?" he asked. Elena's smile was both warm and absolutely terrifying. "General, do you really want to find out what other educational tools humanity has developed?" Vex-Tar looked at the human scientist who had single-handedly crippled his ship and brought an empire to its knees while sitting calmly in a detention cell. He thought about the 42 other volunteers who had infiltrated Korthak facilities throughout their territory, each one carrying the same devastating capabilities. He considered the level of strategic planning and coordination required to execute such an operation, and the biological sophistication necessary to develop weapons that could adapt to function as medical treatments. "No," he said finally. "I believe we have learned enough." Elena nodded approvingly. "Good. Then perhaps our species can find more constructive ways to interact in the future." As human medical vessels approached his crippled command ship, as treatment protocols began restoring his crew's health, and as his empire prepared to withdraw from territories they had considered rightfully conquered, General Vex-Tar finally understood what Elena had been trying to teach him. Humans were not fragile prey animals waiting to be dominated by superior technology. They were persistence hunters who had learned to turn their own apparent weaknesses into weapons that could bring down creatures far larger and more powerful than themselves. They were a species that could carry death and healing in the same breath, that could plan operations across evolutionary timescales, and that possessed the patience to wait for exactly the right moment to demonstrate the consequences of underestimating them. The fragile girl he had struck in anger and contempt had taught his entire civilization a lesson they would never forget, and she had done it while sitting quietly on a metal bench, watching him with calm brown eyes that reflected the patience of a species that had learned to hunt mammoth across ice and stone.